Strategic culture. Strategic culture, as we talked about last week, is a subset of political culture. Where political culture is relevant to all political behavior, strategic culture really deals with security and defense policymakers. Of course, their norms, beliefs, ideas derive from the political culture, but it's even a more specific subset of actors dealing with a more circumscribed set of issues. Now, where does strategic culture come from? On the one hand, it derives from beliefs, images, and historical narratives that are created by the dominant elites, those who determine foreign policy. On the other hand, these narratives in turn shape the elites themselves. So, quoting Jack Snyder, strategic culture is the sum total of ideas, conditioned emotional responses, and patterns of habitual behavior that members of a national strategic community have acquired through instruction or imitation and share with each other. So, strategic culture is created by elites, but in turn it also shapes and creates them, particularly subsequent generations. It's something that develops over time. Now, just to recap what Duffield said about political culture, the same is essentially true for strategic culture. Where political culture, in fact, shapes foreign policy, that's where we essentially get strategic culture. So, strategic culture shapes the collective goals of society, it shapes the perception of the external environment, and it determines the range of possible policy options that are there. It helps evaluate the costs and benefits of policy options. So, when states make decisions about how to interact with their neighbors or with a particular issue, it's not simply a cost benefit calculation done on the objective factors, empirical reality. But empirical reality is filtered through strategic culture and helps determine the options that are available. Now, Duffield also mentions that strategic culture, is particularly important when the external environment is ambivalent, it's unclear. When the external environment is clear, then decisions are probably more conditioned and determined by the external structures. But when things are unclear, particularly after systemic changes, then the strategic culture generally has a very important impact. Furthermore, when decision making is not just dominated by an individual or by a small group of individuals, and presumably therefore more determined by idiosyncratic personality traits. But when policy making is more consensual or has to go through more veto players, then strategic culture is going to have more of an impact. Because again, as we said in the last week, culture is something that people share in common in a society. And lastly, when the society is not divided into a bunch of subcultures, when there is at least a sense of cultural commonality to a certain degree, then strategic culture is going to make a bigger impact. Now, strategic culture makes a different argument than realism, although sometimes the mechanisms of both may be hard to distinguish. In fact, policymakers within a particular country will not see the difference. They believe that they are making decisions based on the hard, cold facts, when in fact, empirical reality is being filtered through strategic culture. Realism argues that decisions are essentially based on rational cost benefit calculation. based on a disinterested, in other words, objective evaluation of the empirical structural conditions. So when a state faces a particular situation, it's going to act in a rational, cool, calm, collected manner commensurate with the conditions that it's facing. In other words, states are going to be pragmatic, they're going to be flexible, they're going to adjust to the situation because um, they are trying to ensure their survival and they're trying to make sure that their power is maximized. Strategic culture, on the other hand, that argument, um, according to that argument, the full range of logically available conditions is constrained. It's limited by a preconceived analytical framework, by pre existing biases. These filter empirical reality. In other words, not all logically available options are actually available within the framework and constraints of strategic culture. So decisions that are made according to the cultural argument tend to be more inflexible, tend to be more dogmatic. Um, the extent to which a state can adjust to a given situation is limited by the strategic culture. Let's have a look at a couple of examples of distinct strategic cultures of major players in the international system. To begin with, the US. One characteristic of American strategic culture is a sense of exceptionalism, stemming from its um, uh, role as a pioneer of democracy and the myth of the frontier state. Um, American foreign policy makers, as a result, are wary of international commitments. So even with international institutions that they have helped establish themselves, like the International Court of Justice, um, they are wary of being under its jurisdiction. So in 1986, for instance, the U.S. withdrew from the International Court of Justice's compulsory jurisdiction. Another aspect of American strategic culture is casualty aversion. America has had a unique geopolitical position in the sense that it is not next to any major rivals. In that regard, it has historically fought less wars in its own neighborhood. So there's a sense of casualty aversion, and particularly since the 20th century, a reliance on technology in fighting its wars. So when a war drags on and the casualty numbers go up, the American public tends to become impatient, and policymakers tend to want to end that war. Another aspect of American strategic culture is the values driven aspect of it. Military intervention cannot simply be done for the national interest. There has to be moral language, a moral purpose for it, even if superficial. And lastly, um, America has a leadership complex. It wants to cooperate with other countries, but it wants to be in charge. And so that uh, poses the limits of its cooperation. By the way, I've posted the book cover of a recently published book by a friend of mine who I hope to get an interview with for this class. What about Chinese strategic culture? While the Chinese have been talking a lot about wanting to peacefully um, project their economic influence, there's a clear sense that underlying this is a broader strategy. Now, one aspect of the Chinese strategic culture, ever since Deng Xiaoping in the late 70s, has been what we can call a patient realism. We bide our time and build up our capabilities. And so China has sought to fly under the radar while increasing its power. There's also a sense of wanting to overcome national humiliation. Part of that stems from the period of colonialism or indirect colonialism of the 19th and early 20th century. Part of that is the decades of non-recognition of the People's Republic of China, when it was actually Taiwan, the Republic of China, that was sitting in the UN. So we can say that Chinese strategic culture is characterized by this need to overcome national humiliation. Thirdly, there's this concept that scholars speak of, this Confucian monist virtuocracy. There's a couple of aspects of this. Number one, there's a need to defend the honor of its leaders. And so one is particularly careful about criticizing political leaders, something that is fairly common in other countries. But particularly external criticism of one's leader is a direct attack on the national security of China. Another aspect of this is the idea that China is a homogenous, unified country, and so the ethnic multiplicity that does exist in China is underplayed, and threats to unity, perceived threats to unity, must be nipped in the bud right away. The idea of this unified and perennial, or we can say eternal, Chinese polity is very important. So if another major power deals with China, scholars argue it has to take into account Chinese strategic culture and not simply objective cost-benefit calculation. What about Russian strategic culture? Well, one aspect of this is the search for security through territorial expansion. So historically, Russia grew by expanding into the vast territories of Central Asia, oftentimes in response to the threat faced by Western European powers. There's also, stemming from its tradition of Russian Orthodox Christianity, this idea of messianic exceptionalism. Russia has a civilizational role to play, particularly on the Eurasian continent. And there's a need for international recognition of this exceptionalism. And thirdly, there is a readiness to use military as politics by other means. So whereas American strategic culture, there is this sense that force needs a moral justification. In Russian strategic culture, scholars argue, this need for moral justification isn't there. One can use it if it's necessary. Well, what about Indian strategic culture? Well, for decades, scholars argued that India didn't really have a strategic culture and that Indian foreign policy makers weren't thinking about it. On the other hand, there is now a recognition that perhaps a distinct Indian strategic culture does exist. One aspect of this has been referred to as the omniscient patrician. India is the world's teacher. Part of this is based on the perception of India having an ancient religion, an ancient tradition, ancient philosophy that was quite sophisticated at a point in time when other countries, particularly in Europe, were nowhere near that level of sophistication. So there's an idea that India, with its timeless principles, some of them derived from the Hindu tradition, can teach the rest of the world how to conduct oneself on the international stage. Connected with this, but a bit more recent, is this idea of Nehruvian moralism, deriving from India's first Prime Minister, Nehru. And here, there's these twin ideas of non-alignment and independence. India did have the chance to align with the United States right after World War II, which was seeking an ally in the new Cold War against the Soviet Union, but Nehru declined, arguing that India as a newly independent country, needed to preserve its autonomy of action. And furthermore, there was a sense of morality by staying aloof from the power politics of the American Soviet rivalry. This Nehruvian moralism still has an impact today, even as India has been throwing its weight around a bit more in the last decade or two. Scholars have also talked about its strategic reactiveness, and this is, I suppose, where this idea of a lack of strategic culture comes from. In fact, India has a strategic culture of reacting and passivity, not actually having an active strategic doctrine of how to act. Uh, this came into play, for instance, in the Indo-Chinese War of 1962. The Indians did not expect a border dispute with China to result in a full-scale war. They did not expect the Chinese, whom they still viewed as a fellow post-colonial state, newly escaped from the clutches of European colonialism. They expected that the Chinese would have a sense of cooperation with them and did not understand Chinese motives or their desire to demarcate the border more to their liking. This is an example of strategic reactiveness. Another aspect that some scholars have talked about is the sense of hierarchy in Indian strategic culture. Some people derive this from the hierarchical nature of Indian society, and then say that this is externalized in its relations, particularly with its regional neighbors. So there's a need for recognition that India is the predominant state in the Indian subcontinent, and that other states, particularly Pakistan, should recognize this. Hassan Askari Rizvi's article on Pakistan's strategic culture. And he essentially argues that there are three key characteristics of Indian strategic culture. He mentions five, but I think we can boil them down to three. Number one, insecurity. Number two, a distrust of India and opposition to Indian hegemony. And number three, Islamic identity. So insecurity, where does this stem from? This stems from the foundation of Pakistan. From the very beginning, even though Jinnah actually expected a cooperative relationship with India, from the very beginning there was trouble, particularly after the Kashmir War of 1948. And on its other side, Afghanistan did not even recognize Pakistan's independence because they still claimed land in what is today Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan. And so Pakistan faced a troubled relationship with its two key neighbors. Connected to that is its vulnerable geographic location, or at least its perceived vulnerable geographic location, as being a fairly long and skinny country with a long border with India that doesn't have any natural boundaries. So there's a sense of vulnerability there. And that has led to an emphasis on high military expenditures to overcome that insecurity. The second aspect of Pakistani strategic culture is its distrust of India and opposition to Indian hegemony. Part of this stems from the experience of partition, as well as the distrust between the Muslim League and Congress before partition. And so, from the very beginning, there's been a distrust of India and an unwillingness to accept Indian hegemony, which of course goes right against one of the key aspects of Indian strategic culture, which is the need to have its hegemony recognized. So how has that had an impact on Pakistani foreign policy? Well, one of that is the emphasis on the raising. Now, the Pakistan knows that it cannot have complete military parity with India, so it has sought to raise the cost of a potential conflict through different means. One of them is the nuclear deterrent. Another means of raising the cost of potential conflict with India to such a degree that India won't even do anything is by the, supporting proxies in Kashmir, which is seen as a cheap, effective way of keeping India busy on the other side of the border. Although, um, from an objective perspective, some might argue that this has actually increased the chance of conflict. But this is part of Pakistan's strategic culture. And another aspect of trying to oppose Indian hegemony is seeking alliances with superpowers. To begin with, that was the United States in the 1950s. When America was rebuffed by India, they went to Pakistan next, and the Pakistanis gladly agreed to do this. And so you had decades of an alliance where the Americans sought an ally against the Soviet Union, and the Pakistanis, while paying lip service to their anti-communist credentials, they were really looking for an ally against India. More recently, beginning in the 60s and 70s, but particularly in the last decades, there's been an emphasis on seeking an alliance with China vis-a-vis India, particularly as America has been seen moving closer to India. The third aspect of Pakistan's strategic culture is its Islamic identity. Part of this stems directly from Pakistan's foundation, which was based on the two-nation theory that Hindus and Muslims constituted two communities that ought to have their own state. And related to this is Islamic symbolism that permeates the Pakistani nation state. There's a limit to this. State institutions, particularly the military, seek to emphasize Islamic identity and symbolism, while at the same time reining in excesses of radicalism and extremism. Another way that this Islamic identity has played a role in Pakistan's foreign policy is with its conflicts in Afghanistan and Kashmir. Of course, in Kashmir, there has been a policy of supporting religiously legitimized groups that are fighting against the Indian state in Kashmir. And the same in Afghanistan. When the Soviets invaded, the Pakistani government under Zia-ul Haq supported Islamist groups that were legitimizing themselves on the basis of Islam and not Afghan or Pashtun nationalism. Now, this has had some trouble and some pushback in the long term within Pakistan, but it has been an aspect of the Islamic identity of Pakistan's strategic culture. Another aspect stemming from the emphasis on Islamic identity has been a need to be seen as the preeminent Islamic state among Muslim majority countries, seeking a leadership role, beginning with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's spearheading the Organization of Islamic Countries, the OIC. Well, now it's your turn. You've been hearing about strategic culture, different examples of strategic culture, and you've read the article by Rizvi. Now, you need to think a little bit about particular case studies of Pakistan's foreign policy, some of which are mentioned in the reading. Think particularly about the debate between the cultural argument and the realist argument. Think of two specific scenarios in Pakistan's foreign policy behavior where it is clear that strategic culture, rather than the dynamics of realism, are explaining the foreign policy outcome. Write one paragraph each for each scenario, and make sure to discuss all of the three main characteristics of Pakistan's strategic culture in each scenario.